Thank you very much, Dr. Bergsten. I am pleased to be here and make some comments on excellent presentation which we heard. And it is really my honor to discuss his presentation because, as Dr. Bergsten mentioned earlier, I've known him for many years, maybe 30 years or so, and this is a very rare occasion to give comments on his excellent presentation. I always enjoyed and learned a lot from his presentation, and I did the same again today. I'm very pleased to listen to his recommendation about Japan proposing, I guess, or Japan going ahead with China's accession to the TPP, and that will be a maybe very important step toward maybe U.S. coming back to the CPTPP. And also I thought the last comment that you made, that China needs to be a responsible country in maintaining this international economic order. And I have some questions. First is, do you see that China is going to be a very responsible player in the world economic activities? You mentioned the subsidy issues, SOE issues, and even now we know the kind of coercive behavior, economic behavior. Take a case of the increasing tariffs on imports from Australia because they didn't like the way Australian suggested about the COVID-19 issue. So this is just one example. And Japan has a problem with China, several problems, boycotting Japanese products and like restricting exports of some very precious raw materials and so on. So again, to me, the track record of China in abiding by the international trade rules is not so good. And I just wonder how you see the China's behavior in this respect. And the second, this is somewhat related to this point that I raised, although you didn't mention this in your presentation, but I think it is true that China wants to be a world leader in various respects. By 2049, that is 100th anniversary year for China's independence, they like to be a world leader. It seems that they are challenging the U.S. kind of leadership. And how do you see that, their kind of behavior toward becoming world leader, not only in economic area, but military and others? I think that is a fundamental problem. If China really wants the hegemonic power kind of overtaking the U.S., that would be a very problematic thing to happen for democratic countries and so on. So this is a second question that I wanted to raise. And third is the CPTPP suggestion that you gave us. It's a very interesting one. But for me, I think not go directly into negotiation. As you know, before negotiation, they have to have discussions. And I agree that they should, they meaning CPTPP members, including Japan, Australia, and others, should start discussions with China, regarding accession. And they have to make sure that China will abide by the rules. And like I said, the track record doesn't seem to be so favorable. And if CPTPP members point out these are the problems, give China some time to deal with these and see what happens. So this discussion may take quite a long time, but this is very important to make sure that China will abide by the rules. And so how do you see this kind of discussion rather than negotiation right away? And third, although I was pleased to hear that the Biden administration is shifting, so to speak, toward more kind of, friendly kind of strategy that Dr. Bergsten mentioned. But as far as I see, the Biden administration is tightening up restrictions on exports of military-related or national security-related products, and also restricting U.S. foreign direct investment outward. So I don't really see the Biden administration is moving toward more, so to speak, friendlier strategy. And so I guess this is just my comment, and I'd like to see your response to this. And finally, although you didn't mention in your presentation AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, set up by China, would be a very interesting, maybe litmus test, so to speak, for Japan and the U.S. Policy toward China. And if I understand correctly, you argue that Japan should join AIIB. If I'm wrong, just tell me I'm wrong. But what if Japan tries to join AIIB? I wonder what the reaction from the U.S. would be. Japan is always, as you know, looking at what carefully watching what the U.S. would do when we do something, right? We are very much concerned about the U.S. response to our action or our strategy. So I just wonder how U.S. would respond to Japan's, engagement in AIIB. So that's the specific question. I guess these are the questions that I wanted to raise. But again, I learned a lot from you, your presentation, as always. And I'm very much interested in your comments or your responses to my questions and comments. Thank you very much, Fred.
Well, thank you, Shu. I really appreciate your kind words and your questions, all of which are very, very good. And let me respond to them in reverse order. You are correct that I think Japan should join the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, but I think the United States should do so too. I think, in fact, the US and Japan should do it together. It's in the same vein that I was saying before. Japan should kind of push the US to work cooperatively with China on economic issues more broadly and in this functional decoupling sense that I talked about. And one dimension of that in the financial area, in addition to the trade measures, would be for both our countries to join the AIIB. Now, if the US still wouldn't do it, I still think Japan should. You remember, and I'm very sensitive to what you said, Japan always concerned about the US reaction to what it does. But remember, the US lobbied all of its other allies to not join the AIIB. And they did so almost immediately when it was set up, led by the United Kingdom, supposedly America's closest longtime ally. They were lobbied hard. They rejected the US lobbying and joined, and so did all the other Europeans and practically every country in the world, including Canada, US neighbor. And I don't think any of those countries suffered any repercussions from the US for joining. So I think Japan could go ahead and do it. I'm sure you'd get a few nasty comments from the U.S., but your answer would be, U.S., you should come in too. It was a huge mistake for the U.S. not to join at the time. It would have been much better off to accept the Chinese invitation to the U.S. to join. I think it should do it now. But I'm glad you mentioned that. I was praising Japan in my remarks. The one place where I think Japan made an error in these last few years was not joining the AIIB. I hope it would do so now, but I hope most of all it would do so with the U.S. Your next to last question was about the tendency of Biden policy. You're quite right. They have been tightening the export controls. But as Sullivan and Yellen both explained in these recent speeches, and I think they're very serious about that, they are attempting to limit that tightening to products, issues, processes that can be persuasively demonstrated to be crucial to national security, not primarily economic products, services, topics, processes. And that's, as I quoted Sullivan, he talks about a high fence, that's your tight restrictions, but in a small yard, limiting the extent to which they apply those restrictions. When they put out their export control restrictions last October, it was a very detailed program, 240 pages, and it was very precise, very specific, and quite limited in its coverage, even in semiconductors, only at the very high end of the semiconductor spectrum. So I understand what you're saying, and the general image is of a tightening, and as the Chinese would put it, an effort to suppress them, to surround them, to contain them. But in fact, what the administration says it's trying to do is much more limited, much more specified as between security and economic. I think they're serious about that, but we all need to push them to make sure they execute it and implement it in that way. Because, as I also said, there are a lot of Americans, and this might be a future administration too, which wants to do something much more expansive, much more comprehensive. That, I think, is what needs to be avoided at this point in time. Now, on your more basic question, before I get to that, in terms of the CPTPP, you asked, what's the right process to follow? I would say simply whatever your standard procedures are. You now have a case study because you have brought in the United Kingdom. So you have an example, you have a case with a big country, big trading country, important trading partner, a little bit outside the original idea of Trans-Pacific Partnership, but okay, UK came in. So you have a procedure. I said follow the same procedure. I don't think you should do anything to particularly discriminate in favor of China procedurally. They should have to go through the same tests and processes and consultations that you had with the UK. Incidentally, I understand that Ukraine has also applied for membership, so you could start with them too. But I would say follow the same process. But my point is simply that if that process gets going, and even if one realizes it's going to take quite a while, I think it would be a real wake-up call to the United States to see China embark on a process that could ultimately lead to membership in the CPTPP. And as I say, if Japan does not kind of foster that development, hopefully with the US then responding positively to come in as well, then I think Japan will increasingly, as the inevitable leader of CPTPP, will be seen as blocking China. And I don't think that's good for Japan-China relationships. I don't think it's good for the organization, and I don't think it's good for the world economy. So I think the better course is to bring them in, or bring them into the process, see if they qualify, but give them an open chance. the U.S., when the U.S. was still in TPP, the U.S. always said, China can never meet the conditions. And that was the justification for keeping China out when the U.S. was in. Now, China has applied to join. Well, that implies they think they can meet the conditions. And so if they can't, it'll have to be demonstrated. And again, I would think the implication would be that once they apply and start the discussions, even before the formal negotiations, they're on a path that's headed in that direction. And that's the dynamic I would like to see happen. Final point, you raised the fundamental question right at the start, and rightly so, can we trust China to be responsible? It's the 64 trillion renminbi question, of course. We don't know. I would say two or three things that make me relatively optimistic. First, China is hugely dependent on the open international economic system. I said way back at the start of my remarks, Japan is the poster child, the most dramatic success story of the open international economic order of the last 75 years. But China is close behind and coming up fast and has had an enormous run. And they know that they're dependent on that open system. They do not want to break it up. And though it's of course clear, as you said, secondly, that they want to be a global power and maybe even they want to surpass the US, we don't know that, but they clearly want to be if not the top superpower, but they also know they cannot afford to jeopardize the global economic system that has been so crucial to their rise and will continue to be crucial to their economic progress, especially now as we see a slowdown and lots of problems with their domestic economy. They continue to rely on global markets, global investment, and they will continue to do so. So they have a huge stake in the open system. The crucial question to me is whether they realize that their own policies that you and I have both mentioned, subsidies to the SOEs, theft of intellectual property, forced technology transfer, retaliation against Australia or Lithuania or Norway or whoever it may be, all those things that China has done itself have triggered enormous backlash against the whole globalization process and raised threats to the continued openness of that global economic system on which they depend. That was the one good thing for Trump. Trump's trade war, I think, should have brought home to the Chinese that their own actions can trigger a major backlash that will hurt them. And the fact that Biden has continued that, and to some extent, other countries are picking up on pieces of that, has to be sending the message to the Chinese that their own policies are backfiring on them and having major adverse effects on their own interests. So I think as China's own dependence on globalization, international markets, continues, is increasingly important to them, and is increasingly clear to them that they can jeopardize it by their own policy, they will become a more responsible actor. I think to the evolution of Japan, early in that process, when I and others were urging you and your friends in Japan to take a responsible position in leading the global economy way back in the 70s and 80s, I think for a while, it's fair to say that most Japanese did not really realize that their own policies were triggering a backlash. The bashing of Japan, we talked about a little bit before the session started today. Japan triggered backlash that hurt its interests in its economic relations with the US and the world because it did not recognize that it was now big enough to have systemic impact. The Chinese now, even much more so. I think they are increasingly realizing that. And I'm banking on that to persuade them to eventually take responsible positions. It is noteworthy, I think, that when China has lost cases in the World Trade Organization, they have pretty completely complied with those cases. The things that they've done that are still objectionable are not covered effectively by the rules. The rules, therefore, need to be expanded. China needs to accept that. That's a big test. That's going to be a big test of whether they will be responsible and meet your very legitimate question as to whether they deserve to have leadership. But that's why I stress the conditional nature of all this and the absolute essential of holding them to it. Now, there may be some changes in the rules that they may insist on. Some of those we may not totally like, but that's the give and take of the negotiation that I think is going to be essential. But I do believe that as they realize now, if they are going to become a global superpower, if they are going to challenge the U.S., be roughly equivalent to the U.S., as I put it, or if they think they can surpass the U.S., they can only do that if they carry out responsible policies, because otherwise, not just Japan, but the rest of the world will not accept it, and they will be frustrated. And that's then what I fear is the risk of the Thucydides trap and conflict that we must do everything we can to avoid.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Box, and thank you very much for Dr. Urata. Actually, now it's time to close the webinar, but allow me to extend a few minutes and I'd like to pick up the questionnaires from the audiences. Yes, concerning the China's accession to CPTPP, okay, I will ask you two questions. The first one is the accession of China. What about the risk of China actually participate in CPTPP and the US not participating? Will it not be a pretty bad result? Is this not a risky gamble? And also, what will happen to Taiwan if Japan promote accession of China to CPTPP? Wouldn't it worsen the national security tension between China and Taiwan? This is the first question. And the second question, I'd like to pick up this one. Please provide advice on Japan's current diplomatic stance. Specifically, what strengths of Japan could serve as influential factors if it were to mediate between the US and China? On the other hand, are there any areas where Japan lacks or should improve? Yes, actually, it's great that Japan could serve as a guide on U.S. Finally, yes, and hopefully to the Chinese government and to help the international sector in Chinese government. So could you respond to the two questions? The first one is accession.
Sure. Sure. Also, very important, very good questions. On your second question, what areas could Japan best mediate? I'm focusing in the economic area, which I think would be Japan's comparative advantage. And I would say, particularly trade, for the reason I mentioned, that Japan, for a while, was the world's leading trading power, and certainly is still one of the top two or three, and has enormous credibility because of what you did with the TPP. You have trade agreements with the United States. You have trade agreements with China in the RCEP. You have trade agreements with the rest of Asia through both RCEP and the CPTPP. So I think Japan is uniquely positioned in the trade domain to intermediate between the U.S. and China. I would suggest your starting position should be to tell them, now, fellas, you should get rid of your trade war. Neither the U.S. nor China is gaining anything from this current trade war. They could end it on a totally reciprocal basis, so neither one would be accused of giving in and being soft on the other. They could do that. But But with or without that, I think Japan would be a very natural intermediary on trade. Development finance is another area where Japan has been very constructively supporting infrastructure investment in Asia itself, uh, in a way without making a lot of noise about it, competing with the Belt and Road Initiative. Um, Particularly if Japan and the United States were to take my earlier suggestion of joining the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, then I think Japan would be in a very good position to talk to the Chinese about joining the Paris Club or the common framework for debt rescheduling. One big area that underlines the need that all our countries have to cooperate with China is now debt relief for the 50, 60 or more poor countries that have unsustainable debt burdens, in large part because of their liabilities to China and the fact that China has not heretofore been willing to cooperate in working out debt relief schemes. Now, Gong at the recent IMF meetings and subsequently in a speech at our Peterson Institute, said that China was now willing to work on the Zambia rescheduling and be cooperative more broadly. If that's true, that's a good step forward. But that's, again, an area where I think Japan would be in good position to intermediate. So I think Japan would have good bonus fides to do that. On your first question, what would happen to Taiwan? I would say Taiwan, of course, has applied for membership in the CPTPP. I recall that when the same issue faced APEC, way back when APEC was created, 1991, a formula was worked out that brought in China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong as three separate independent members of APEC, all at the same time. And that was worked out through very skillful diplomacy by Korea, which happened to be the host country for the APEC leadership meetings in 1991. I knew quite well the ambassador who did it. And Japan could do the same thing now, I think, in trying to promote simultaneous discussions, as Urata-san put it, with Taiwan and China. I suspect Hong Kong is not going to be a separate entity now, but I would think the same formula could apply as it did to APEC. At least that should be put to China, and the CPTPP countries could make that a condition. Say, well, we're ready to discuss with you, but Taiwan has also applied, and so we want to carry out parallel discussions between the two. It'd be understood Taiwan would not be accepted until China was, as in the case of APEC, but I think you could do that. And then your more basic question, what would happen to CPTPP if China came in without the United States? Well, it'd be very unfortunate. I don't think the dynamic would work out that way. But if it did, I'm not sure it would be a bad thing for Japan or the region. There were many, many fears expressed when China first joined the IMF and the World Bank after the Deng Xiaoping reforms got going in the late 1970s. There was great fear that they were going to destroy the IMF and the World Bank. Never happened. They've been model members. China has, in fact, been a huge supporter of IMF programs in recent years, providing lots of money from their very ample foreign exchange reserves to the IMF to lend, even to countries that are not of great interest to China, like Ukraine and Egypt. They've been model members of both the IMF and the World Bank. Similarly, there were fears expressed when they joined the WTO that they would be disruptive. Well, now people complain that the deal was unfairly stacked in their favor. I don't think that's right. And as I said, they have accepted and implemented WTO decisions that have gone against them, which a number have. They've brought a number of cases and they've won some and lost some. So again, I think they've been a responsible member. And my broader point, going back to what Arada-san said at the start, is that there are a number of occasions on which China has showed responsible global leadership. There are some where they haven't, and there are a lot of areas where they do deviate, as he said in his questions. But let's face it, all of our countries do deviate sometimes. The United States certainly does, and certainly has in recent years been a rather bad actor in terms of its WTO obligations. So I think if I'm right, that China will want to be a big player, will want to be accepted as a big player, and recognizes that failure to live by the rules in broad terms, at least, can have big adverse effects on its own interests, then I think with a bit of faith, we can presume that they will be a responsible member. And it's a lot better than trying to keep them out and running the risk of conflict and confrontation down the road.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Buxton, and again, Dr. Urata. I'd like to conclude today's webinar. Thank you very much for your participation, and have a good day. And good night, Dr. Buxton. Thank you very much for joining from the East Coast of the United States.
Thank you all very much for having me.
Yeah, thank you very much.